Welcome to The Green Fix. In this podcast, we explore how businesses are navigating a changing world through the lens of supply chains, sustainability, and tech.
Before we get started, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today and pay our respects to elders past and present. Our guest today comes to climate risk through balance sheets, capital management, and bank stress tests. Andrew White spent more than 15 years at Suncorp, most of it in the Chief Risk Office, finishing as Head of Sustainability Risk and Stress Testing. He then built Baringa's financial services practice in Australia and now runs YT Advisory and the Katumi e-learning platform. As someone who operates comfortably within many camps, we wanted to talk to him about geopolitics, the current and future macroeconomic forces on Australia, as well as how leaders can incorporate these challenges into their transition plans and operational resilience strategies. Andrew White, welcome to The Green Fix.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So we're going to start very high level. More than any other year, geopolitics have really cracked the mainstream, if you will. Businesses are thinking about how they're being impacted by what's going on around the world. Can you start with what is geopolitics? And why is it important for businesses to be taking it seriously?
I'll probably start with my definition is probably quite a crude one. I like to think about things simply. So geopolitical risk it really boils down to how nations use power, economics, trade, technology to exert influence over other countries and shape global outcomes. So that's probably my starting point. In terms of businesses and commercial decisions, as you rightly point out, it has been growing in significance and it's been growing in terms of ranks of global risks as well. It starts to matter more and more because it starts to influence business more and more. And certainly the last 12 months, it's really started to take shape under new political regimes as well, as nations start to exert influence over how businesses should and could operate.
Andrew, I'd love to stay on this topic and go a little bit deeper into the mechanics of geopolitics. Maybe we can start with a bit of history as well. So what are some of the key principles that the world has been organized by, in particular since the end of World War II?
Yeah, so 80 years is a long time to cover. So I think in the essence of time, we can kind of boil it down to at the end of Second World War, certain conventions and certain parties were established, the UN being one of them. The IMF, the World Bank, was also established. The World Trade Organization sort of started back then, but really it didn't really kick off until 1995 because of certain countries not coming to the party in terms of agreements. In terms of some of the key principles and foundations, there's certain conventions where the UN exists to enable the ability for nations to act freely. And it also provides for things like dispute mechanisms as the same way that the World Trade Organization does. But one of the conventions is Law of the Seas, which has been quite helpful because it means that shipping lanes, particularly for Australia, shipping lanes should be able to remain open, which, as we've seen, that theory has been tested in the last 6 months. But it will also become more critical, I expect, in the next few years as well. There's another convention around trade and development, which Australia is also a party to. That's about supporting beneficial trading systems. And as an island, we're quite reliant on that. Less relevant to Australia, but also quite impactful in a geopolitical sense, was the formation of NATO, which, for those not familiar, it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So a lot of those countries that were originally involved in the war, I think it had about 12 countries that originally signed up. But what we've seen over the last 80 years is NATO has actually expanded in terms of countries. And one of the reasons why Russia invaded Ukraine, apparently. The expansion of these bodies could be seen as a good thing, but it can also be seen as a catalyst. There are lots of US allies through the NATO Treaty Organization that they're now right on the border of Russia, and Russia doesn't like that. Whilst we might think it's a good thing, it can also be part of the reason why conflicts and tensions have started to escalate when things are sitting right on another country's border. A problem that Australia doesn't necessarily have so much.
Yes, true. Although we do have a lot of very strong trade relations with some of those members. That was a very good overview of the past 80 years. Thank you. In terms of where we find ourselves now, how are those structures, relationships changing, and what are you currently keeping an eye on?
So the expansion of NATO was kind of an interesting one. People would notice that the US is one of those members of NATO, and the US has probably been the most erratic member of a lot of these alliances, particularly both in terms of security and trade. Within the last 8 months, there have been strategic challenges around actions. NATO is a defensive treaty. It's not an aggressive treaty. So if one nation is attacked, then others will come to the aid. And we've seen that with Ukraine, where other nations weren't fighting on behalf of Ukraine, but they were providing support. And that's really why the NATO members were stepping up. When aggressive action is taken, like what we've seen with the US, Israel, and Iran, NATO members are stepping back and they're saying, well, that's not really what this is about. So that's one of those interesting dynamics that's worth continuing to monitor, because that in itself starts to create tensions around why these alliances have been formed, and have they been formed under different pretenses for what governments are existing. Interestingly, 10 days ago, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey formed the Mecca Joint Defence Pact, which is interesting in its own sense, because it's really the first Muslim-related countries coming together to form a pact. It's interesting in the sense that Turkey is also a member of NATO. It's interesting in the sense that Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey all have their own unique attributes that they can bring to this kind of defensive treaty, and they also all have their own strategic misalignment. I don't want to say enemies, but it is kind of leaning towards the countries that they are in dispute with. So Pakistan is in a dispute with India, which is quite interesting from our point of view. Australia outsources and offshores things and has a huge trade relationship with India. Saudi Arabia has Iran, which has obviously been shown to be quite significant in the last 6 months. And then Turkey has Israel, which is also quite interesting in the context of the broader challenge. But it's also interesting in the fact that Turkey is a NATO member. The US is a NATO member. The US has a very strong alliance with Israel at the moment. And if there's already competing tensions with Turkey and Israel through NATO, this gives them another mechanism through which other counterparties can help them act. So we talk about a fragmented world, even in your shared socio-economic pathways that we use for climate change, but it's also fragmenting in a way where it's strategic realignment rather than just not looking to do business or to trade or have security arrangements. It's quite complex, but also quite interesting.
Super interesting. Andrew, I think it would be interesting to explore the idea of these global organizations. Two in particular you mentioned was World Trade Organization and the UN. Could you maybe give us a snapshot of the role of these organizations, the differences, and how they are currently behaving, or what are some interesting developments in the way that these organizations operate?
Sure. Well, they're non-politically aligned organizations is probably the first point. They both have a shared role in trying to bring countries together to ensure that there's no further escalation in disputes beyond a certain matter. The UN, for example, is really so that World War II never happens again. That was the original intention behind why it was created. Whereas the World Trade Organization is to ensure that a dispute mechanism exists for counterparties. And whilst they say within some of their roles that they'll seek to resolve trade disputes within 45 days, what we've actually seen in reality is it's a very different time frame, which also matters from a business point of view. If you're a Treasury Wines and your wine is sitting in a shipyard in China not ready to come in, and you're going to your Member of Parliament lodging a dispute, it can still take 18 months. That's a long time for products and goods to be sitting there not moving freely from place to place. So that's probably where the nuances exist. The UN has a lot more conventions, whereas the World Trade Organization is just focused on trade. There's trade and development that sits within the UN, but there's also, as I said, the law of the seas is a really prevalent one at the moment, given the amount of goods that comes via seas. I think it's about 95% of goods comes to Australia via shipping lanes. So it's quite significant.
Wow. That's actually a really good segue, Andrew, because I did want to talk to you about the impact on Australian businesses. What are the less obvious or I guess more hidden impacts that you're seeing? But also, what are you foreseeing the next 12 months, 24 months?
If we come back to that point where 95% of Australia's trade is done via shipping lanes, it's really important for businesses to understand what is actually coming in and going from Australia, because if we're sending things out via export, that's income coming back. But if we're relying on things being imported from other countries, which we have a huge reliance on, then that also starts to matter, because a lot of the businesses are saying, well, I only need this widget, but this widget is actually coming from 4 other parts that are imported from somewhere else in the world. So that's quite an interesting challenge for businesses to try and think through. Is my component parts and my control of my supply chain is actually quite limited. The starting point for some of the conversations is, how much trade are we doing with certain regions? Are there potentially signals of change that are starting to take place? One of the challenges with what happened with US, Israel and Iran was that tension was always there, but it was really just a matter of a latent one where we weren't expecting anyone to actually action, which is why that switch was flipped so quickly. And when you turn off 20% of a supply of a commodity, the markets tend to react that way. And that starts to drive up inflation. Supply side shocks are things that we should be getting a little bit more used to. And we had that with COVID. It's one of those things where we need to start to understand those global dependencies more and more. From a forward-looking point of view, there have been tensions around South China Sea for some time. What we do know is that Xi Jinping has made a commitment around unification, and there's roughly a 5-year term where that's kind of reassessed around the parties' commitments. So we would expect something to happen between now and 2028, 2029. Why does that matter is probably the interesting thing. And Taiwan makes 60% of the world's semiconductors and microchips, and they make about 90% of the world's sophisticated semiconductors and microchips. So those ones that are used in smart devices and AI. So as the world starts to move more towards AI, we still have this critical dependency on a specific region. And I think there's about 4 companies that manufacture those within about 10 kilometers of each other. So there's actually quite a significant geographic concentration around that. That's probably where my attention starts to go to in the next 12 to 18 months. But then there'll be other things that we aren't focusing on. And I've certainly fallen prey of that in the past when I've tried to look at stress tests around pandemics, and we've tried to focus too much on one thing and we've left everything else open. And it's really the things that we're not looking for or trying to pay attention to that really tend to catch us off guard.
It's interesting that you say that, just focusing too specifically. If you're sitting in a boardroom at the moment, you could be thinking we need to react to the Strait of Hormuz being closed, without thinking, well, there's a lot more straits and canals around the world. Why don't we shift our thinking more towards what is the outcome rather than the action?
I think what's interesting about this, and I'd love, Andrew, your take on it, is the precedent that the upcoming changes in the Strait of Hormuz management and the potential imposition of duties or passage fees, and how that's impacting the idea of the law of the seas and free trade. What does that precedent do to all of the other passageways around the world?
It's certainly an interesting dilemma. One of the things about the Strait of Hormuz is that the Gulf region, and you're starting to see diversification out of that Gulf region anyway in terms of how things are being transported because of the cost. So there's always a cost. If going through and paying a toll is the fastest and most efficient way for companies to continue to move goods, then they'll wear that cost. But because it's a Gulf, that the strait is almost the only way out. Whereas other straits, Strait of Taiwan, you can go around it. Even the different canals around the world where they might be impacted by drought, you can go around it. It takes longer and it costs more. So that doesn't mean that it's as significant a pinch point. I'm happy to be wrong. I enjoy being wrong. So some of these pinpoints where you'll see things will incur an original cost, but at some stage the market dynamics will start to fluctuate. There will be inflationary pressure. Consumers will wear it at the end. And then depending on where that lands, you'll either find a new way forward, especially if it's there long enough. These types of changes also can breed innovation and the seeking of alternative routes. So, and that's what we're seeing is oil's going out overland towards China, because that's where the dependency is. We're going, well, if we can't use the sea, then we'll use the land. But then we just have to negotiate with all the countries that will be along the way to make sure that things can pass freely over land. That will be one of the main changes. International waters has certain protections and activities can happen in there. Missiles fall into the South Pacific all the time. So that's one of the things that we just need to be mindful of. If there is a pinch point at some stage, if it's there long enough, then we'll absorb it in the first instance, and then we'll seek alternatives over time. And that's really one of the factors that we need to look at when we design stress tests and scenarios as well for how we think about these things.
Speaking of those stress tests, Strait of Hormuz has probably got more ink written about it over the past 8 months than it has in the past 200 years. But what are some of the areas outside of South China Sea and the Gulf that you think business leaders should be keeping an eye on?
Well, outside of Australia, it's not so much, it may sound crude, it's not so much the location, it's the people that drive the concern, because both trade and security work well when there's stability. So if there's not stability, then that's really where markets will react. Businesses are going to be less confident because you're not sure about what's happened. For the longest time, businesses were reluctant to do business in Argentina and go and build a factory because there was always the risk that it would just be nationalized and they'd kick you out of the country. That in itself is not a new issue, but it's a matter of who's looking stable. And what we've seen in the last, certainly this year, is Mark Carney is now going around providing the voice of stability around middle powers and what free trade and security alignment looks like. We've seen some larger countries on the security space flex their muscle, operate quite erratically, both from a trade point of view in terms of tariffs. We aren't quite at the stage of sanctions, but sanctions are quite interesting because some of the sanctions are actually being lifted to try and enable oil moving a little more liberally around the world. But from a security point of view, we've talked to NATO, we've talked to the Mecca Strategic Defence Pact. Some of those things are going to be quite new, but it's how do you try and have certainty when these political realignments are actually taking place? I think that's going to be an area of focus, certainly for the next 3 to 4 years. The electoral cycle tends to be 3 to 4 years in some countries anyway. What happens when the next president of the United States comes in? What are the policy positions, and what's the sentiment in America would be the interesting one around who gets voted in and what does that actually mean. We already have polarization, and that polarization is reflected in political leaders, and that then has a cascade into the global scale. So that's the things that I'm focusing on for some of the scenarios that we need to work through is what does a new normal look like for the next 2 to 3 years, but also what might the evolution of this be if the status quo continues, or does it start to change and swing back the other way? It's just a matter of how violently that swing is.
It's a really interesting point, particularly mentioning Argentina, because if you look at Argentina over the past 24 months, they stepped in when China needed to get soy from another country when the US tariffs came in. But then they've also stepped in when China has needed access to oil. And so they have done well on the China trade, even though President Milei and Trump are quite supportive of each other's policies. You have this space where the US is losing trade to China on soy. Argentina's stepping into the gap, and then they're doubling down on that from an oil perspective. You mentioned Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, when he speaks about the middle powers working together, just how quickly the fortunes of a middle power country can flip depending on a whole range of events taking place.
Glad you bring up oil, Dan, because I did want to take it into the realm of energy security and reliance on the global oil markets. And in particular, would be keen to understand your take on all of these changes, including if Strait of Hormuz, but other hotspots of energy and oil changes or factors. So how is it all impacting our local energy security?
It's a really interesting place that Australia's in because we export 80% of our energy, and it's quite common that people will talk about that. We only use 20% of our energy. A very small percentage of that is actually liquid fuels. So liquid natural gas is predominantly what we produce. We import the rest of that. So Australia as a country, we're really good at producing raw materials and extracting that from the earth. We have very minimal capacity around refining and finishing certain goods and materials. So that in itself plays through to why we've started to experience a shortage. We have 2 oil refineries in Australia. When one catches fire, then we've got 1.5. So that starts to play through into our dependency and how soon and how urgent that is. The irony of it is, whilst we might export 80% of our energy, the reliance on liquid fuels has more to do with Australia's geography. Australia is one of the largest countries in the world with a relatively small geographic population per land area. The geographic spread across just even the east coast of Australia or east to west, it's a huge cost for transportation, which is still relying on liquid fuels. So that as a sector means that you could be producing things on agricultural land, but you can't actually get it to a market that costs more for food just in transport costs. So we've got plenty of solar, we've got renewables that are starting to be rolled out, and we've also still got plenty of coal and plenty of gas. So if we needed energy, it's a matter of, is the energy mix right for how Australia operates is probably the interesting and the challenging part for us at the moment. Having said that, it was in the news the other week that we have oil tankers sitting off the coast of Queensland waiting to be able to get into port, and they just haven't been able to get into port, and fuel excises are changing. So part of that is how quickly can we get things in? Where is the storage capacity? We've actually run down storage capacity over the last 20 years. And I think that's less so on the privatised side, more so on the public side. There's a threshold for the IEA. Part of it's private, part of it's public, and the private side seemed to be met, but it was the public side where there was lacking. So I think that's probably going to be where, if there are pinch points that will come, they're more likely to come from our need for liquid fuels rather than our abundance of other forms of energy.
And going back into historical decisions, the national fuel storage strategy being one, what are some of the unintended consequences for the national economy and businesses that have come out of decisions that were made 10, 20, 30 years ago?
It's always the unintended consequences that tend to get you with the decision. It's kind of a direction of where the world's going. For whatever reason, Australia didn't need an abundance of fuel onshore because trade markets were opening up, and in a way the geopolitical context for everything is starting to talk to the end of what could be described as a 30-year cycle around abundance and free trade, and the geopolitical context is starting to reshape that impact. The unintended consequences will always emerge when the status quo changes. What we're seeing now is cost and efficiency aren't necessarily the only drivers of decisions that can and should be made. It's about how resilient is a supply chain, how resilient is a business model, how resilient are our customers from a business point of view, or our citizens if you're in the political space. That to me is more of the fundamental shift for reframing the unintended consequences, because you've made it based on a set of principles that might no longer apply, or that don't hold water when you're actually putting a different lens or stress over it. What might happen is 15, 20 years from now, that mindset shifts back to cost and efficiency. We see it with outsourcing of businesses. You move it offshore until you realize someone cuts an undersea power cable and you can't communicate with that offshore business anymore as a third-party provider. So I need to bring things back onshore no matter what the cost is, because I need to be able to operate. So I think that, to me, it's not so much an unintended consequence, it's just a changing of a landscape in a way that forces you to think differently or develop a different mindset.
Can we stay on this idea of looking in the rearview mirror? We talk a lot about unprecedented times these days, but the reality is we've got a lot of history and background that we can use as leverage for decision making. And maybe we can talk about a couple of key milestones that have put Australia in particular in different pathways. One we could talk about is the global financial crisis, the GFC in 2008.
Yeah, well, if we have, how did we fare during the GFC, or what did we learn from the GFC? The answer is probably not as much as others. Did we learn as much as others from the COVID point of view? Possibly. Take the GFC as an example, and we talk about unintended consequences. Different countries acted differently. Now, Australia wasn't completely unscathed. There was government guarantees of deposits, which, again, it's about providing certainty. So the government acted in a way. I'm pretty sure we all got $900 at some stage to try and. So, there was a stimulus to try and avoid an economic downturn. If we tried that trick today with the current levels of government spending, you're in a completely different situation. That's one of the starting points. You need to recognize where you are today. Are you in a situation that is the same? And don't be mistaken to think that it's the same conditions, you can do the same things and they'll work just as effectively. If you take the example of what happened in Ireland, the banks failed in Ireland. The government stepped in. Ireland was one of those countries that was caught up in a sovereign crisis because sovereigns couldn't afford to support the banking sector and the financial system. So we talk about unintended consequences. There was a cascade that played out over years. So the sovereign crisis, if the GFC ended in 2009, 2010, 2010, 2011, 2012 was all about a sovereign crisis, particularly across those countries in Europe that couldn't really afford it. So it's how do you try and help the companies absorb the losses in the right way, or is it right to let them fail? We're going through a similar process at the moment with certain smelters across Australia. What does government support look like, and is it the right thing to do? It's an ethical question as much as a business question. Do we need these entities to continue to operate the same way, or does it mean market consolidation? It's a challenging point because you're never quite in the same situation as what you were. So whilst you can learn things from the past, it's quite often a new situation and a new challenge that you can rely on the thinking of the past and the adaptation techniques of the past, but does it require a new solution?
We might shift the conversation a little bit. In this podcast, one of our key focuses is climate, sustainability, how we're focusing or not focusing on climate today. I'd love to get your take on how companies today should be thinking about climate and sustainability. Any insights from the field that you want to share?
Yeah. From a mandatory disclosures point of view, the bar has shifted. That can be seen as a good thing. What is taking place at the moment is there's a maturity curve that a lot of businesses around Australia are undergoing. What we're seeing in terms of disclosures is plenty of first order risks are being identified, and in part, that's because of how the regulations have been structured. So it's not just a matter of what's the risk to your business model, it's actually what's the risk to your value chain. It's giving businesses a direction to go. There's a value chain on both sides. So there's a customer base where market sentiment can shift towards or away from your business and your model. And then you've also got your upstream value chain. Where am I getting my goods from? And are you looking far enough into that supply chain and that value chain to understand where your level of influence takes place, in the same way that businesses are expected to look through the business chain and supply chain to understand modern slavery risk. Ultimately, you run out of your ability to influence at some point. So then the question then becomes, well, how do you diversify, or how do you try and make sure that you have resilience in there if something starts to happen and take shape? So I think over the next 2 or 3 years, there should be an evolution in terms of how those risks are described or assessed and then articulated back to investors. Investors don't like being caught out as significant changes start to take place that nobody saw coming, again, you can come back to something like semiconductors. We know that there's a concentration there. So if you need that for headlights and for smartphones and for how your business operates, and you're not seeing that as a risk now, in 12 to 24 months, if something happens, you need to be thinking about that on the fly. It's interesting from a point of view of how does that start to impact Australia's importing of solar. Renewable energies have a significant reliance on microchips to operate. That's why the next 18 months becomes so interesting. If you still have a liquid fuel crisis going on and you have growing competition and challenge around the transition towards renewables, what does that actually mean from a transition point of view? That impact is going to play out differently on different business models. So that's going to be one of the key things, I think, from a climate risk point of view. It also will flow through into different Scope 3 emissions. Obviously, now that will become mandatory over the next few years and auditable, again, the bar is raising in terms of expectation around that data and the use of that data.
And in terms of that stress testing and of the impacts, that is such a multi-dimensional, complex assignment. How do you go about trying to get a read on those situations when you're working with companies?
So to try and break it down, there's really three components. If you want to be really simple, you've got an upstream value chain, you've got a business model, and you've got a downstream value chain. Under each of those sections, there's really two slider bars. So the first one is how quickly does the change move? And if you're moving it to the left, can the business, the value chain, absorb a very rapid shift without breaking? And if it breaks, then what are some of the things that will play out? The second slider bar that sits underneath it is how long does that stress need to hang around for things to break? So you've kind of gone in two different directions. And again, you can use examples like COVID to test it out from a practical point of view. COVID happened really quickly from a communications and from a spread of people and contact, required a very quick and prompt response. And those that responded quickly did better than others with a firm line. But then COVID hung around and you had other consequences that played out over a longer period of time. And if companies or governments didn't act fast enough, then they saw a longer tail in terms of a consequence. If a business is trying to assess those risks, you're kind of thinking about it as those two dimensions. You can always increase or decrease the amount of stress, but it's really the mechanics of how quickly does something change and does that system, either in the value chain or in the business model, still hold? And if it does hold, how long can it hold for? So those are really two of the fundamental questions that I think businesses should be using as part of how they want to assess climate change, geopolitical impacts as well. So it becomes quite helpful to try and break it down to those really simple levers to pull.
Yeah, it's really interesting, really valuable as well. I guess we try to make sense of the multiple pressures around us. Andrew, thank you so much for today's episode. It's been so insightful, really valuable. I also love the way that you really set the context for us. To close out, what would be one piece of advice that you would give to business leaders in Australia?
I might be cheeky and take two. The first one is really the observation that the thinking around cost and efficiency, that assumption where that matters most is starting to move to one of resilience. So how are you following that logic in terms of what the world is demanding? And then the second part to that almost then becomes there are a lot of things that every business is juggling at the moment in terms of priorities. I think one of the key things will be how do you try and make time to just take a step back, plan for some of these broader things that are going to impact you. It might not impact me now, but it will impact me in the future. Spending some time on that will become key, because if something does happen and you've got it down, it might not produce a result, but it starts to at least tick off in your mind to give you confidence that you're able to start seeing things from signals and noise across the market in a way that you can start to interpret what's happening and how it's going to impact your business going forward. So start to use those forward-looking signals. So that's the two-parter response that I would encourage business leaders to think about.
As Loretto said, Andrew, it's been so good to have you join us today. I think there's like a number of buckets of Australian businesses The first bucket would be the ones that are involved in import-export, directly exposed to international trade markets. And so they're very much across what we've spoken about today. But then I think there's probably another two buckets. One, tangentially exposed, but like nothing really critical. And then the third, no exposure, inverted commas, and therefore hasn't been an area that people have historically needed to focus on. What has come out of this conversation is those days are gone. We are moving, if not already arrived, into a new world where the relationships, trade partnerships, conventions are now shifting. And we're having, as a country, as industries, as companies, and as individuals, to figure out what does that look like for us and how can we best position ourselves. And I think the way that you have explained it all so succinctly and in such an interesting manner, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
No, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Andrew.
This was Green Fix with your hosts, Loretta Gutierrez and Dan Levington. You can get your Green Fix every 2 weeks on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Pocket Casts.